My father looked me straight in the eyes and called me a burden. He picked up my suitcase, carried it to the front lawn, and dropped it in the wet grass like it meant nothing. Then he pointed toward the driveway and told me to get out and never come back. I stood there in the porch light, 26 years old, watching the only home I had ever known close its door on me. Less than 12 hours later, I was standing inside a $30 million mansion overlooking the Pacific Ocean, holding a set of keys with my name engraved on the title. But the house was not the biggest surprise waiting for me that night. Inside, on the kitchen counter, was a letter from my grandfather, a man I thought had taken his secrets to the grave. It began with 7 words. "Your father has been lying for years." I thought being thrown out was the worst thing that could happen to me. I had no idea it was only the beginning. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Nothing in my life was what I believed it was, and by the time this story ends, you may find yourself asking the same question I asked myself that night on the beach. What would you do if you learned that everyone you trusted had been lying to protect a secret that was never theirs to keep? Why would my grandfather secretly leave an entire fortune to me and not to my father, his own son? Why did my father resent me for reasons I could never explain, even as a child? And what happened 20 years ago that made my grandfather spend the rest of his life quietly protecting me from a distance, without ever telling me why? I did not have those answers yet. All I had was a letter, a locked gate, and an attorney standing in the doorway of a house that supposedly belonged to me. He looked at me the way someone looks at a person who does not yet know the weight of what they are carrying, and he said, "Your grandfather told us this day would come." My name is Grace Whitfield, and to understand how I ended up on that beach, you need to go back to the years before any of this happened, back to a house in Ohio that used to be full of laughter before it became full of silence. My mother, Diane, passed away when I was 11. She had been sick for almost 2 years, and I remember the smell of her lavender lotion more than I remember most of her sentences, because by the end she barely had the strength to speak. After she died, something in my father changed. Richard Whitfield had always been a strict man, but he had also been warm in his own quiet way. The kind of father who let me sit on his lap while he read the newspaper. That warmth disappeared with my mother. He became distant, short-tempered, and impossible to please. I used to think grief had simply hollowed him out. It took me years to understand there was something else underneath that grief, something he never let anyone see. My grandfather, Walter Whitfield, became the one steady presence in my life during those years. He would drive 2 hours every other weekend just to take me fishing or to sit with me while I did homework at his kitchen table. He never raised his voice, never criticized me the way my father did, and he always seemed to know exactly what to say when I was struggling. I did not know it then, but he was watching me far more closely than a grandfather usually watches a grandchild. He was taking notes. He was keeping records. He was preparing for a day he hoped would never come. I still remember the smell of his old truck, motor oil, and peppermint candy, because he always kept a tin of them in the glove compartment for the drive home. He used to tell me that a person's character shows up most clearly in the small moments nobody is watching, the way you treat a waiter, the way you speak to yourself after making a mistake. At the time, I thought he was simply filling the silence on long drives home from the lake. Looking back, I understand he was building something in me on purpose, quietly laying a foundation he suspected my father would never help me build. He never once said a harsh word about my father in front of me, not even on the days I could tell he wanted to. By the time I was 20, I had learned to expect very little warmth from my father. He criticized my choice of college, my choice of major, even the way I spoke at family dinners. I told myself he simply had high standards, and if I worked hard enough, one day he would finally be proud of me. I graduated with a degree in marketing, took an entry-level job at a firm 2 hours from home, and threw myself into my work, hoping that success might soften him. It never did. Every promotion I earned was met with a shrug. Every raise was met with silence. I kept working anyway, because somewhere inside me, I still believed that love from him was something I could earn if I just tried a little harder. There were good days too, and I do not want to erase them from the story just because of how things ended. My father showed up to my college graduation and sat in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else when they called my name. He helped me move into my first apartment, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs without complaint. For years, I held on to moments like these as proof that the coldness was temporary, that the man underneath, it was still there, still capable of showing up. I did not yet understand that showing up in public and protecting someone in private are two very different things, and that a person can do one without ever managing the other. Then, 6 years after my mother passed, I lost my job. The company downsized and my entire department was let go without warning. I moved back into my father's house temporarily, telling myself it would only be for a few weeks while I found something new. Those weeks became months. My father grew colder with every day I stayed unemployed, making comments about people who could not take care of themselves, about how disappointed my mother would have been. I applied to dozens of jobs, took every interview I could get, and still came up empty. The tension in that house became something you could feel the moment you walked through the front door, thick enough to make every dinner feel like a countdown to an argument. The argument finally came on a Tuesday night in early spring. I had come home from another interview that went nowhere, and my father was waiting for me in the living room with my suitcase already packed and sitting by the door. He told me he was done supporting someone who refused to make something of themselves. I tried to explain that I was doing everything I could, that the job market was brutal, that I was not lazy, I was struggling. He did not want to hear it. He picked up the suitcase, walked it to the front lawn, and dropped in the grass. Then he pointed toward the street and told me to get out and never come back. My Aunt Linda was there. My cousin Ashley was there. Nobody said a word in my defense. They simply watched. I spent that night sleeping in my car in a grocery store parking lot. The seat reclined as far as it would go, my jacket pulled up to my chin because the heater made the battery light flicker. I remember staring at the ceiling of the car and asking myself what I had done to deserve a father who could throw away his own daughter over a few months of bad luck. I cried until I had nothing left, and then I simply sat there in the dark, exhausted, wondering what I was supposed to do next. Around 2 a.m, there was a knock on my window. I nearly screamed. Standing outside was a man in a dark coat, calm and unhurried, who introduced himself as a private investigator working on behalf of an estate. He said 4 words that changed everything. "We've been looking for you." His name was Daniel Cross, and he worked for a law firm that had been trying to reach me for nearly a week. He explained that my grandfather had passed away 8 months earlier, quietly, after a long illness he had kept hidden from most of the family, and that his estate had finally cleared probate. He asked if I would come with him to a property in Malibu, California, first thing in the morning, because there was something my grandfather had left specifically for me. I remember laughing, half out of exhaustion, half out of disbelief, because nothing about my life at that moment suggested I was about to be handed anything except more bad news. But something in the way he spoke made me trust him, so the next morning, I got his car. The drive along the Pacific Coast Highway felt like stepping into someone else's life. Waves crashed against the rocks below the road, and the morning light turned the water a color I had never seen in Ohio. We pulled up to a security gate, and beyond it stood a white house that looked like it belonged on a postcard, 3 stories of glass and stone facing directly out over the ocean. Daniel led me through the front door, and the inside was even harder to process. High ceilings, an open kitchen, a staircase that curved down into a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows. He handed me a folder and told me plainly that the house belonged to me. I asked him if this was some kind of mistake. He shook his head and said my grandfather had predicted I would ask exactly that question. I walked through the rooms slowly, almost afraid to touch anything, the way you move through a museum instead of a home. There was salt in the air even inside the house, carried in through a cracked window somewhere upstairs, and the wood floors creaked in a way that felt lived in rather than staged. In the study, I found a leather chair angled toward the window, worn down in a shape that suggested someone had sat there often, watching the same waves I was watching now. I ran my hand along the armrest and wondered how many evenings my grandfather had spent in that exact spot, thinking about me, while I sat 2,000 miles away believing he had simply forgotten me the way the rest of the family had. Inside the folder was the first letter. It was written in my grandfather's handwriting, the same handwriting I remembered from birthday cards when I was a child. He explained that he had purchased the house nearly 15 years earlier and placed it in a trust that would only transfer to me once I turned 26 or once a specific condition was met, whichever came first. He wrote that he had watched my father grow colder over the years and suspected, long before I did, that a day would come when I would need somewhere safe to land. Then, near the bottom of the letter, he wrote a single line that stopped me cold. He said the mansion was not my inheritance. It was only where the truth would finally be waiting for me. I did not have long to sit with that confusion, because 2 days later, cars began pulling through the security gate. My father arrived first, furious that I had somehow ended up in a house worth more than anything he had built in his entire life. My aunt and uncle arrived shortly after, along with my cousin Ashley, all of them staring at the house with a mixture of shock and calculation. Nobody hugged me. Nobody asked how I was doing after being thrown out of my own home days earlier. My father accused me of manipulating my grandfather in his final years, of turning a dying old man against his own son. He stood in the driveway, pointing at the house the way he had once pointed at the street, and told me I had always been calculating, even as a child. I asked him calmly why he thought a 26-year-old woman sleeping in a parking lot had somehow orchestrated a 15-year-old trust document. He did not have an answer for that. Daniel Cross stepped forward and calmly confirmed that every document had been prepared and notarized years before my grandfather's illness even began, long before I had any reason to suspect this house existed at all. My father's face went pale. He said this was not over, then turned and walked back to his car, leaving my aunt and uncle standing awkwardly on the driveway, unsure whether to follow him or stay. If you're still watching, drop your city or stay in the comments. It's always amazing seeing where everyone is watching from, and I would genuinely love to know how far this story has traveled by the time you're hearing it. Over the following weeks, Daniel began walking me through the rest of what my grandfather had left behind, and layer by layer, a different picture of my childhood started to form. My grandfather had quietly paid for my college tuition through an anonymous scholarship fund, letting me believe I had earned it entirely through my own academic record. He had covered my first apartment deposit after graduation through a program I assumed was offered by my employer. He had even intervened once, early in my career, to make sure a manager who wanted to let me go during a slow quarter kept me on staff instead, all without ever taking credit or letting me know he was the one protecting me. Reading through it, I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and grief because the man who had done all of this had never once asked for a thank you, and now I cannot give him one even if I wanted to. Then, tucked behind the letters, I found a folder with my name written across the front in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and inside were bank statements, years of them, tracking a trust fund my mother had apparently set up for me before she passed away. According to the documents, that trust was meant to cover my education and eventually help me buy my first home, fully funded and untouched for years after her death. But the most recent statements told a different story. Large withdrawals had been made over time, money meant for my tuition and my future quietly disappearing, with notes from my grandfather scrawled in the margins that simply read, "Not approved, replace immediately." Someone had been draining an account that was never theirs to touch, and whoever it was had ignored every warning my grandfather had left behind. Daniel pulled the account records the following week, and there, at the bottom of transfer after transfer, was a single signature authorizing each withdrawal. I'm not going to tell you whose name it was just yet, but I want you to sit with that question for a moment, because I already had a feeling in my stomach about whose signature it would be before Daniel even turned the page around to show me. Some part of me had known for years, in the way you know something is wrong long before you have proof, in the way a house can feel cold even when the heater is running. I stared at that signature for a long time before I finally said the name out loud in the empty kitchen of a mansion that suddenly made a great deal more sense than it had days earlier. To understand the rest, I need to go back further to a private conversation my mother had with my grandfather 2 months before she passed away, a conversation I only learned about through her journal, which Daniel found tucked inside a safe deposit box listed in the estate documents. In her final weeks, weak from the illness that was taking her, my mother made my grandfather promise to protect me, no matter what happened to her marriage, no matter what my father became after she was gone. She had already started to see the coldness forming in him, and she was afraid of what it might mean for me once she was no longer there to soften it. Her journal was full of small hopes for my future, dreams she wrote down as if writing them could somehow guarantee they would come true, savings goals, plans for my education, a wish that I would someday have a home of my own by the ocean, because she loved the water and had never gotten to live near it herself. Reading her words made something in my chest tighten in a way I had not felt since the week she died. She wrote about my father with a tenderness that made it clear she still loved him, even as she worried about who he might become. One entry, dated only weeks before she passed, said that she hoped he would remember what family meant once his grief settled, and that if he ever forgot, she was trusting my grandfather to remind him. Reading that line, I understood something painful, that my father had not simply drifted away from me after her death. He had made choices, one after another, that took him further from the man she believed he could still be. I was not abandoned by accident. I had been protected on purpose, by 2 people who saw a danger in him long before I ever could. The largest reveal came during a formal meeting at Daniel's office 3 weeks later, when he laid out binders documenting every property, investment, and business account connected to my grandfather's estate. It became clear that my father had controlled significant portions of family finances for years, presenting himself to relatives as a careful steward of my grandfather's wealth, while quietly redirecting funds meant for my future into accounts and ventures that benefited only himself. He had convinced my aunt and uncle that my grandfather's late-in-life decisions were the product of confusion and age, discouraging them from asking questions, all while my grandfather sat back and documented every dollar my father moved without approval. As the binders were laid out one by one, I watched my aunt's expression shift from confusion to disbelief, and I realized she had believed my father's version of events for years, the same way I once had. Justice did not come through anger or public confrontation. It came quietly, through lawyers, through frozen accounts, through documents that could not be argued with no matter how loudly my father raised his voice. Assets connected to the misused funds were identified and restored, and my father was required to formally account for years of unauthorized withdrawals in front of the same relatives who had once stood beside him, without question. I was not in the room for that meeting, and I did not need to be. Daniel told me afterward that my father tried, at first, to explain the withdrawals as loans he intended to repay, then as decisions he had every right to make as the eldest son. Neither explanation held up against 15 years of my grandfather's handwritten notes. Ashley called me a few days after the accounts were settled, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it, apologizing for standing silently on the lawn the night I was thrown out. My aunt sent a letter of her own, admitting she had chosen comfort over asking hard questions for far too long. My father, meanwhile, grew more isolated with each passing week, not because anyone plotted against him, but because the truth simply stopped leaving him anywhere to hide. In the months that followed, I did not move back to Ohio, and I did not try to rebuild a relationship with my father. Some viewers might expect a dramatic reconciliation at this point in the story, a tearful apology, a slow return to the family we used to be. That is not what happened, and I think it is important to say that honestly. My father sent one letter, weeks later, short and defensive, more concerned with how the situation looked to the rest of the family than with how it had felt to me. I did not respond. Healing, I have learned, does not always require the other person to change. Sometimes it simply requires you to stop waiting for them to. The final letter from my grandfather was the shortest one in the entire folder, and it was the one that stayed with me the longest. He wrote that money disappears, homes get sold, and people leave, but truth and character remain long after everything else is gone. He said he had not written this letter to give me an inheritance, but to give me the one thing my father had never managed to give me, honesty. As I sat on the back deck of that Malibu house one evening, watching the sun lower itself into the ocean, I finally understood what he meant. The mansion was never the point. It was simply the place he chose to make sure I would finally sit still long enough to read the truth in his own words. I want to ask you something before we close this story, because I think it matters more than the ending itself. What do you think hurt more? The night my father threw me out onto the lawn, or discovering years later that he had been quietly lying to protect himself the entire time? If you had been in my position, sitting in that car at 2 in the morning with nothing but a suitcase and a bruised sense of who you thought your family was, do you think you could have forgiven him? I'm not sure I have fully answered that question for myself yet, and I do not think there is a wrong answer to it. Some wounds heal into forgiveness. Others simply heal into distance, and both of those outcomes are honest ones. As I placed my grandfather's final letter back into its envelope that night, I understood something I do not think I could have understood at 20 years old. He had not rescued me by leaving me a house on the coast. He had spent years quietly preparing me to stand on my own, long before I ever knew I would need to. He had left me something money could never buy, and once that truth came fully into the light, the people who had chosen silence over honesty were the ones left with the least, not because anyone punished them, but because the version of the family they had built on convenient lies simply could not survive contact with the truth. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you have not already, subscribe for more unforgettable stories about family, resilience, and the truth that always finds its way to the surface eventually.